NASA says that currently, there is a stunning opportunity to focus on the planet Venus. This follows the recent discovery of possible signs of life on the planet. If you happen to explore NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the Space Association calling Venus a planet of judgment. Meanwhile, Mars became the primary goal. During the wild space race era, cautious naming of essential planets wasn't common. The Soviet Union was focused on sending numerous missions to Venus. The staggering planet showed virtually no potential for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. According to Neil deGrasse Tyson, we are finally understanding why. Join us as we examine declassified photos from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the USSR was significant in more ways than one. It not only changed the global course of history but also unlocked numerous insider secrets. One such secret suggests extraterrestrial contact may have been a possibility. The USSR held many untold mysteries. Before the US took the lead in planetary missions, the Soviet Union was dominating the game. The USSR had a long history of both successful and failed space missions, but its primary focus was on the extremely hostile planet Venus. In Russian, Venus is called Venera, which is also the name of their mission that lasted from 1961 to 1983. During this time, the US was busy sending missions to the moon. The Soviets, on the other hand, chose to direct their resources elsewhere. Why did the Soviets obsess over the second planet from the Sun? Were they hoping to use its surface as a potential power station? Or perhaps planning to colonize the planet after searching for signs of life beneath the surface? The question remains, why were the Soviets so focused on this furious planet? Given the Cold War era, they weren't entirely transparent about their goals. In fact, all that we know about the Venera missions comes from declassified and unarchived information. Despite significant effort pinpointing what the Soviets were looking for, it remains unclear whether they ever uncovered Venus secrets. The Soviets didn't land on Venus once or twice but made numerous attempts. In total, they launched 28 expensive rockets toward the planet, 13 of which entered Venus' atmosphere, while 8 successfully landed. These complex missions placed the Soviets in a leading position in space exploration. Sure, the US was a close second, but NASA was more focused on satellites and innovative technology rather than searching for life on other planets. Their primary attention was on Mars, which wasn't particularly strange or hostile compared to Venus. Interestingly, Soviet missions to Venus marked several historic firsts. They achieved the first soft landing on another planet and successfully returned pictures and sounds from its surface. These achievements occurred years before similar US successes. So, why don't we hear much about these accomplishments? One reason is the Soviets' penchant for secrecy. Additionally, when the USSR dissolved in 1991, many of its original records were lost or destroyed. This has led to gaps in our understanding of their Venus missions. This is precisely why we don't have a clear answer regarding why the Soviets launched 28 rockets into Venus' atmosphere. However, we can make an educated guess. Perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about cost-effectiveness than anything else. It's not to say that the space program didn't recognize the planet's potential. They were looking for signs of water, sunlight, radiation, and general characteristics of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been incredibly difficult to assess Venus' high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Today, many scientists don't believe that the hostile planet could support life. The temperatures there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce due to its dense atmosphere. The atmospheric pressure on Venus is at least 90 times that of Earth. Nevertheless, despite the planet's harsh conditions, the Soviet Union's contribution to Venus exploration should not be overlooked. To ignore it is to revise history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth exploring. Even though Mars became the primary focus in the space race, Venus missions were not out of the question. However, sending probes to Venus was more expensive than Mars exploration. One of the key differences between Venus and Mars lies in their distance from Earth. On average, Venus is only 40 million kilometers away, whereas Mars is about 250 million kilometers from our planet. This vast difference in distance results in a significant difference in cost. Had the US not been the world's largest economy, it may never have explored Mars so easily. Various reports suggest that Soviet missions were risky and had significant technical flaws. Of course, the rockets couldn't cover huge distances, and the Soviet space program had a history of losing contact with its rockets. So, it makes sense that the Soviet space program opted for a more practical and relatively closer mission that would yield results. If we don't consider the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The US wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet space program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move sparked the space race and fueled its momentum. What's particularly interesting is why the US focused on the Moon rather than Venus. NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s. As a result, the US Space Agency became disillusioned, leading to what became known as the Venus Curse. Every time they launched a probe into Venus' atmosphere, it failed. This was precisely when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to take advantage of NASA's failures. At the time, both the US and the USSR were determined to win the space race. The best strategy was to take advantage of two specific opportunities. It was a quiet yet deliberate strategy. The Soviet space program seized Venus as its first victory in the space race, achieving something that its main rival had failed to do. Despite limited resources and a faltering government, the Soviets repeatedly launched missions to Venus to maintain their leadership position over the US. In contrast to NASA's focus on the Moon, the Soviets' decision to concentrate on Venus was not without its opposition. However, clever propaganda was used to overshadow their major failures with Venus. The American government was urged to investigate the USSR's obsession with Venus, with the media labeling Venus the hostile planet, while Mars became the focus of humanity's destiny. These names didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to show their dominance over the Americans, and they succeeded. Although the Venera missions are nearly forgotten in modern history, they were incredibly advanced for their time. Despite early failures, these missions were highly refined. At the start of the space age, the Venera program led the way. The Soviets began testing the designs and technical details of their probes throughout the 1960s. Over the next 3 decades, they continued to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since this program ran alongside the Cold War, the Soviets focused on strengthening their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with more resources than the US, which turned out to be incredibly significant. This allowed them to build larger rockets capable of withstanding high altitudes and covering vast distances. The Soviets were quick to experiment with both manned and unmanned rockets, while the Soviet academic community worked on a series of calculations and evaluations to chart exact courses for the Venus missions. Behind the scenes, their Mars programs were also running. Nothing was more important than developing advanced instrumentation for these missions. This led to major breakthroughs in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3, which became the first artificial probe to enter Venus' atmosphere and successfully land on its surface. This accomplishment heightened the competition between the two superpowers. Unlike the American missions, which were plagued by failures and setbacks, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite their successes, the USSR managed to send successful probes into Venus' atmosphere. The central struggle with this approach was limited design capabilities. The Soviets quickly overcame their design problems and launched some of the most sophisticated probes of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their pioneering efforts allowed them to achieve the first simultaneous launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most space history experts, this was the most significant decade in the history of space exploration. In fact, the US also attempted to develop similar launch systems, but the Soviets were ahead. To understand why the Soviet Union chose simultaneous launches to Venus, it's essential to recognize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to gather the highest level of data and evidence. The probes were initially sent to study the planet's surface, and that's precisely what happened with Venera 4. Since the launch went perfectly, the probe successfully entered Venus' atmosphere. The Soviet program continued with Venera 5, but this wasn't just a repeat mission. The real breakthrough came when the device successfully transmitted data back to Earth. Remember, Venus' surface was like a virtual furnace. The probes quickly melted once they reached the surface. These challenges only added to the program's overall complexities. Interestingly, Venera 7 was the first probe to return data about Venus' surface and atmosphere. Despite the Soviet space program going through tumultuous periods, it remained highly active with new missions. By the late 1980s, the program had made significant progress. It's crucial to remember the long history of these efforts, which began in the 1960s. Despite some challenges with testing and development, the Soviet space program proved its legacy through these missions. So, why doesn't NASA or other countries recognize the Soviet space program as much? This may be due to NASA's goals of focusing on the Moon. By the time NASA made its major strides toward the Moon, the Soviets had already gained significant ground in Venus-related missions. Their focus on Venus during this period provided clear objectives that kept them ahead in the space race. By the mid-1980s, the Venera program had achieved its ultimate victories, with numerous successful missions providing valuable data about Venus. The Soviet space program's ability to adapt and refine its spacecraft design allowed it to endure the challenges of Venus' harsh environment. While the missions were often short-lived, the information gathered about Venus' surface, atmosphere, and extreme conditions reshaped humanity's understanding of the planet. The Soviet Union's final success with Venus came with the launch of Venera 13 in 1982, which returned the first color photographs from Venus' surface, showing a barren, rocky landscape. Despite the planet's extreme temperatures, which could melt lead, and its thick, poisonous atmosphere, the images provided undeniable evidence of the planet's desolate surface. The Venera 13 probe survived for over 2 hours, long enough to send back crucial data, before succumbing to the crushing pressure and intense heat. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the Venera program effectively came to a close. However, the data gathered from these missions continued to influence space exploration for years to come. Unfortunately, with the collapse of the USSR, much of the official documentation and materials regarding the missions were lost or neglected, leading to the diminished recognition of the Soviet Union's remarkable achievements. In the aftermath of the Cold War, Russia's space program, known as Roscosmos, inherited the legacy of the Soviet space race. However, the shift in political power, combined with changing global priorities, meant that Venus no longer held the same strategic importance it once had. Nonetheless, the Venera missions remain a testament to the creativity and determination of the Soviet space program. While NASA's missions to the Moon and Mars have often captured the public's imagination, the Soviet Union's early and successful missions to Venus are frequently overlooked in modern discussions of space exploration history. The technological feats accomplished by the Soviet Union, such as landing probes on Venus and transmitting data under extreme conditions, stand as a remarkable achievement in the history of space exploration. In recent years, interest in Venus has been reignited, with NASA and other space agencies planning new missions to explore the planet. This renewed focus on Venus reflects a growing understanding of its potential to provide insights into planetary evolution, climate change, and even the possibility of past life. As new missions are launched, the legacy of the Soviet Venera program continues to be recognized, and their pioneering work in Venus exploration is beginning to receive the attention it deserves. In conclusion, the Soviet Union's Venus missions, while often overshadowed by other milestones in space exploration, were groundbreaking. The Venera program's successes paved the way for future missions to Venus and other planets. Despite the challenges they faced,